The scandal around Twitter and its purchase by Elon Musk raises a number of important questions that are not getting the attention in the media, and that's why we're going to talk about it now. The first and the biggest problem is this. Twitter is a social institution. It's the way millions of people communicate with one another, all kinds of important information. As a social institution upon which our society relies, it is a very serious challenge to democracy if one individual is controlling it, deciding what we can and cannot communicate, how, when, where, and at what expense. And when you realize that Mr. Musk has absolutely no particular qualifications to do any of that, having made money developing an electric automobile, you realize what a strange society we live in. But in case you haven't thought about it, let me remind you, lots of inventions over time made by particular individuals came to be understood as social institutions and therefore taken over by society and run by governments or other kinds of social arrangements, but not left in the hands of private entrepreneurs. Schools. Here's one. Schools were started, if you go back far enough, by individual private institutions. But we now have a basically public, free education system, at least through high school. Hospitals were once private institutions driven by the profit of those who ran them, but many are now public. Roads, bridges, harbors, trains, soldiers, police, garbage collection, postal systems. You get the picture? Twitter is one of those, and it ought to be run by people collectively in communities and subject to governmental and community control. In other words, Twitter ought to be a publicly controlled utility, just like all those others are, and not run as a private profit. When you add that Mr. Musk clearly did not understand what he was getting into, having fired thousands of people, having threatened that he may go into bankruptcy when he had a charge of this quite powerful and successful institution, only makes it all worse. There should be no allowance for this. Give the people who develop Twitter some money if that's a reward for coming up with something useful, and then run it for the public, by the public, of the public, which we're supposed to stand for, but which Twitter is a mockery of doing. Number two, and it isn't all that different. On November 9th, the owner of Facebook, or in its new name, Meta, Mr. Zuckerberg, laid off 11,000 workers. First of all, let's get that clear. One person figuring out what's profitable for his company wrecks the lives of 11,000 people. And not just the 11,000 who lose their jobs. But let's go through it. Their spouses, their children, the communities that depended upon them. What happens to all those people? What happens to their lives, to their kids in school, all the rest of it? Smash, chaos, no one cares, no one does anything. One man's decision. He's obviously made lots of mistakes in his life. Those are bad enough. This one costs 11,000 people their job, if it's a mistake, which it probably is. Wow. But I want to focus on a particular point. People like Mr. Zuckerberg are constantly telling us that the enormous wealth they accumulate based on the profits earned by their companies is somehow appropriately given to them. And why? Because they took a risk. Let's be very clear here. The capitalists tell us they take a risk, and the profit is the reward to risk. If our capitalist also works in the company he invests in, well, then he gets a salary for that. Work gets you a wage or salary, risk gets you profit. That's what they want us to believe. But it is, if you allow me, BS. Why? Because the workers take risks too, and no one pays them anything for it. The worker who goes to work at Meta or Facebook may have traveled enormous distance to take that job, moved her family across the country, moved her kids in and out of schools, disrupting their lives, made a decision to take out a mortgage to own a home. They took enormous risks to work at a place that just fired them, 11,000 of them. They took a risk. And there's a difference. The risk a worker takes is that the people who run the business will make a mess of it, like Zuckerberg, and that they'll get fired. Whereas Mr. Zuckerberg, who takes a risk, is in charge of the business he's risking his money in. He has some control. The worker has none. And if the business goes bad, the employer, Zuckerberg, can ease the problem for himself by firing the worker. But the worker, for the risk he took, he can't fire the boss. That's what the word boss means. So here we have it. In capitalism, capitalists get rewarded with profits for taking a risk. Workers, they get paid for their labor, but what do they get for the risk they took? Nothing. That's not a system that's fair or just. It's the opposite.